In this video, we're going to be discussing why, when you're practicing a Tai Chi Straight Sword form, you hold the empty hand in this posture. Now, this hand posture goes by a lot of different names. We're just going to refer to it as sword fingers, hand posture. We're going to discuss several different perspectives as to why this hand posture exists and why it's used or why it's maintained through a Tai Chi sword form. And at the end of this video, we're going to discuss probably the most practical reason as to why this hand posture exists and what its purpose is in the form. So be sure to stick around for that. So before we actually start discussing why this hand posture exists, I would like to teach you how to do it first. So what you do is you basically take your ring finger and pinky finger and you bend them. You put your index finger and your middle finger together and they point up, and you just bring the thumb across kind of to hold those fingers down. Typically it just touches the last joint on the ring finger all the way at the end here, and it just lightly touches there, kind of holding that finger down, holding it in place. Some variations are that you keep these two knuckles aligned and you put the thumb between them. I learned just touch there, and that's how I teach it. So if your teacher says do it a different way, do it a different way, but if you're one of my students, then the thumb just touches the ring finger, these two fingers are bent, those two fingers are straight, and that's all there is to it. So that's the hand posture. If you've done any Tai Chi sword forms before, or really any Chinese martial arts that include the straight sword, you probably already are familiar with this posture. But if you're new to all of this and you've not encountered this hand posture before, basically you use it for whichever hand is not holding the sword. So if the sword is in my right hand, my left hand is holding this posture. If the sword is in my left hand, then my right hand is holding that posture. Often this posture is also used when the sword is in the left hand. So very often when you hold the sword in the left hand, you're holding it with the fingers pointing toward the pommel of the sword and the blade going down along the forearm. And so what you do is you do the same hand posture. You put these two fingers along the blade, and then the rest of the fingers wrap around the sword here. So you have that same ring and pinky coming down, thumb coming across to touch the last knuckle of the ring finger, and then you have the two straight fingers down along the handle. So that's another place where it shows up. Sometimes this hand posture is changed, and what is done is you just have your index finger going down the handle, and the rest of the fingers wrap around the hilt of the sword like so. So of course, whichever way your instructor tells you to do it, you should do it that way, but those are your two options, this one, and this one of course is the same as what you do with the empty hand. So it's keeping that continuity of hand structure in both hands while the sword is in the left hand. So whether your instructor tells you to use the one finger going down the handle or both fingers going down the handle, do what they say, of course, and know that both ways are completely okay. It's just two different ways of doing it. So now that we've talked about how the hand is actually held in that posture, that brings us to the question of why does this hand posture exist? It doesn't seem like a very useful hand posture, so what is its purpose? So the first perspective that we're going to be discussing is using this hand in sort of a supporting role. And that can be either to balance out the body motion. So if I'm extending with the sword hand, I'll also extend, sometimes, not always, with the left hand to balance what's happening with the body. The other thing that it's used for in a supportive role is actually supporting the wrist or the elbow somewhere along the arm when you're doing a cut or a deflection. It's there to support that motion. And the support in those motions is really just offered by those two fingers. So it's not like you place the whole hand as the supporting hand. Use those two fingers to contact the point of support. So this perspective is quite reasonable in some respects. As far as balance goes, it's not uncommon even in Western fencing to see people placing their hands in a posture, the hand that's not being used, being placed in a posture to kind of support the body structure and the balance so that they're free to use the sword hand from a very balanced structure. So this idea of using that as a counterbalancing hand or a balancing hand for your motions does make sense. The idea of using the hand as a supporting hand for what you're doing with the sword doesn't make as much sense, even though you see it used that way a lot throughout the Tai Chi forms. And the reason it doesn't make as much sense is because supporting your motion with just two fingers really cuts back on the amount of support that you're offering, whatever technique you're doing. So if I'm doing a cut across and my only support is these two fingers, well, I would put a lot more support behind that cut if I just put my hand on the wrist, or even if I grab the handle with that other hand. So those are two ways that you could put even more support behind whatever technique you're doing very easily without really changing your motion that much. So why is it that we hold the hand like this? So this perspective of it being there for counterbalance makes sense, but it doesn't really answer the question of why the hand is specifically positioned like this, because that's not necessarily the best way to support what you're doing. So I think that perspective partially answers our question, but doesn't actually give us the real reason for that hand posture. So the second perspective we're going to talk about is sort of built on the previous perspective, using that hand in a supporting role, but instead of like a physical supporting role, it's more of an energetic supporting role. So this hand posture is believed to really help a person focus their energy through the hand. And if you're practicing Taiji with really the internal energy aspect is sort of the forefront of what you're doing, then it makes sense if you've put something in your right hand that is going to draw energy here, that you would also want to do something with your left hand to balance that energy flow. So this perspective really makes sense if your main objective of practicing the Taiji sword or any Taiji form is to work with the energy movement in your body. And if that's your objective, then anytime you put something in your hand that's potentially going to draw energy asymmetrically through your body, it makes sense to do something on the other side that will help balance that energy flow. When we consider that Taiji was created by a culture that places a lot of emphasis on internal energy movement and has incorporated that into internal martial arts like Taiji, then this hand posture does make sense from that perspective. However, we should remember that Taiji was created as a martial art first, and later on it became popular as a form of exercise. So any traditional hand posture like this that exists in the form and that has lasted this long is based on something that's very practical and will help you stay alive in a sword fight. So while this explanation for why this hand posture exists does make sense from an energetic perspective, I don't think it actually reaches the core meaning or the core reason as to why this hand posture exists. But that's one of the beauties of Chinese martial arts. There's many aspects to them that can be used for several different things. So like this hand posture, we're going to get into more perspectives of why it exists, but just because it may exist for a specific reason doesn't mean that it doesn't have other uses. The next perspective we're going to talk about is, again, sort of built on the previous perspective that we talked about. So this perspective takes the idea of using that hand posture energetically to a whole nother level. And the idea is that as you develop your internal energy, then you can use this hand posture actually to direct energy toward an opponent and use that as an energy attack toward that opponent. Now, with this perspective, it's worth noting that there are people who believe that's 100% possible. There are people who think that's baloney. And in this video, we're not really focusing on whether that's possible or not. I will leave it up to you to decide whether you think that is possible or not. But for this video, we're going to move forward with the perspective that say it is possible. And that's one of the actual reasons that this hand posture exists. What then? Well, one very important thing to consider is if it is possible to send energy through your fingers as an attack toward an opponent, there's probably very, 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 very few people who have ever lived who have reached a point where they can actually do that, do it consistently, and do it effectively. So for this hand posture to be placed in even the most foundational movements of Taiji sword work, it doesn't really make sense that it would be a foundational movement if very few people ever actually attain the usefulness of it. It seems more likely that if this was something that only high-level people that had built their energy up to a point that they could project it out of their fingers could use it, then that hand posture would be saved for people at that level, and something else would be used for all of the basic training. In other words, it's not really a practical thing to make so commonplace in training, if its application is so advanced and so difficult to reach and something that most people will never attain. Another issue with this perspective is the fact that the movements of the Taiji sword form don't really match up with the idea of using your fingers as an attack, shooting energy at your opponents when you look at the directions that the fingers face through most of the techniques. For example, in the movement the swallow skims the water, you come across with the sword cutting horizontally, and these fingers come up above the head and are pointing off to my right side. So my attack's here, so my opponent's probably somewhere in that direction. My fingers are pointing over there. So unless I'm shooting energy at someone over there and fighting someone here at the same time, it's probably not why those fingers are there. Additionally, the use of this hand posture, as we talked about before, for like supporting the wrist when you're doing a cut, or when you're doing the little dipper posture, and you have it, depending on who your instructor is, you'll either have it in toward the elbow or up toward the wrist, and you're using those two fingers, they're pointing up off this way, and they're supporting what's going on. So that doesn't really match the idea of it shooting energy either. Now you will see some variations in movements, so like when you're doing the big dipper posture, and you have the sword pointing up here, and that sword finger hand out in front. Sometimes you'll see it done this way, and that tends to support the idea that maybe this is an attack, shooting energy out there. But the fact that that's only one variation of a movement that can also be done this way also tends to indicate that maybe this isn't the main reason for this hand posture. Based on all those issues with that explanation matching up with common use and how the hand posture is used in the form, I don't think this is either the main use or really the best explanation as to why this hand posture is held. The next perspective that we're going to discuss is the idea that these fingers are used physically as an attack, either to pressure points or just to sensitive areas on the body. Right off the bat, I'm going to say that this explanation has the same issue as the last explanation in that the movements of the form the majority of them don't really support that as the main use for this hand posture. So like we talked about, the swallow skims across the water. I don't know what points I'm attacking on my enemy if my fingers are up here. If I'm supporting, then obviously that's not attacking anyone. And if I'm in the Big Dipper posture, this movement could be an attack if you're doing it this way, but there's also this version of that movement, and so this isn't necessarily going to be a great attack if I'm trying to use the tips of my fingers to attack something and they're pointing up. This perspective is completely reasonable for some people. My master, who I trained with during my last trip to China, had hands that were so conditioned that if he wanted to use his two fingers as an attack, it would definitely be effective against pretty much anyone. He could break slabs of granite with just those two fingers. Now, that level of conditioning and that level of power through just those two fingers is pretty far beyond what most Tai Chi practitioners will ever attain. Although I'm sure China is filled with masters with that skill. For most practitioners, their hands will never be that conditioned, and trying to use those two fingers as an attack against someone is more likely to cause harm to the person doing that attack than to the person being attacked. With that being the case, I think that this is another really good example of an explanation for this hand posture that is partially true, but doesn't contain the whole picture. So again, based on the fact that the movements of the left hand during the sword form don't really match the idea of attacking an opponent with those fingers, and the fact that most people will never attain a level of hand conditioning that would make such an attack actually effective or practical in any way, this is not the main reason or the best explanation as to why this hand posture exists. We're now going to discuss why this hand posture exists from a very practical perspective. Now, this perspective posits that this hand posture is held sort of as a placeholder. Now, it's very common in Chinese martial arts to find certain hand postures that don't seem particularly practical on their own, but they're really just a placeholder in the form to remind the practitioner that when they're doing this technique, there's multiple options available to them. This is one of the things that I find really cool about the Chinese martial arts, and I think it's one of the many things that definitely points to the brilliance of the people who created these arts. And this is a really good example of why it's so important to have a good instructor when you're learning Tai Chi. If you're not taught by an instructor that one of the main uses for this hand posture is as a placeholder, and we'll talk more about what that actually means in a minute, but if you don't have that instruction, it's not really obvious, and it's not something that would just necessarily occur to you and be very forthcoming when practicing the form unless you're told by an instructor this is what this is for. So again, if you are learning Tai Chi and you have an instructor in your area that you can train with, I highly recommend that you try to get involved with an instructor that can bring these sorts of things to light for you. Now, one of the main things that this is a placeholder for is using the sheath of the sword while you're practicing. And part of the reason that many people don't realize that's one of the main uses for this hand posture is how we practice our forms. We always tend to take the sword sheath off, we set it somewhere, and then we practice our form. And then when we're done with the form, we clean off the sword and go put it in the sheath. We never really interact with the sheath as part of the form that we practice. But if you were living back in the time when Tai Chi really existed as predominantly a martial art, and it was the way that you would defend yourself if you were on your way home and were attacked by bandits or whatever would happen that would force you to need to use your Taiji skills with your Taiji sword to defend yourself. You wouldn't face off with your assailants and say, wait a minute, take off your sheath, go set it down somewhere where it's probably not going to get stepped on while you guys have your fight. Come back, say, okay, I'm ready, have your fight with them, and then when you're done, go pick up your sheath and put it back on your sword. You would have it with you that whole time. And you would keep the sheath with you, keep holding on to it for several reasons. One, of course, is so it's not just laying on the ground somewhere where it's going to get stepped on and busted up for no reason. The other is that this is potentially one more barrier between you and whatever attacks are coming at you. And anything that would give you an upper hand or even the slightest advantage in a situation where you are needing to defend yourself is something that you would absolutely use. When I was first beginning in martial arts, I had an instructor who told me if you're defending yourself, if you're fighting for your life, you use anything in your environment, anything that you have on hand to help yourself make it through that alive. And his example was even if all you have is a pair of work gloves, you put those on because typically you'll hit harder if you have any type of covering on your hand, and it would offer some protection for your hands. And even though that's not much of an advantage, every little bit helps. And if we move from that work glove example back to what we're talking about here, which is the Tai Chi Straight Sword, having a sword in one hand and your sheath in the other hand is going to be better than having a sword in one hand and nothing in the other hand. So your sheath is going to be kind of the predominant thing that you use in that placeholder hand. But the reason that hand posture is a placeholder is because it doesn't have to be your sheath. If your sheath is broken, if it falls, whatever, anything that you can have in this hand that's going to help create more of a barrier between your opponent's attacks and your safety is going to be a plus. So whether it's your sheath, a stick that you pick up, another sword, a knife, whatever, having that available to you is going to be better. Now the purpose of using that specific hand posture while holding whatever it is you're going to hold is if you hold it like this, it's kind of difficult to get it to push up against your wrist as easily. It's kind of difficult to control where it's going as much. If you grip with those ring finger, pinky finger, and thumb, and then you push down whatever it is that you're holding with the other two fingers, you can hold it against your forearm easily, and so that gives you more control over what it's doing both this way, so those two fingers give you control that way, and then the rest of it gives you a good grip and control otherwise. And when we think about this hand posture with something in that other hand, the movements of the form make much more sense. So let's use those same movements that we talked about earlier. So we'll start with the swallow skims the water. It's from back here, and you notice that this is guarding anything coming across this way. So any swinging attack this way, I have something there. And of course, a sheath is not the most amazing thing as a means of defense or fighting, but it's better than nothing. So I have something there to protect me, and then as I come across, you can see that there's a deflection up high that totally makes sense now with something in that hand as I'm cutting. Now my attack is in this direction, and my defense is in that direction as well. So you can see now that that movement makes sense with that hand posture there. Now if I do that movement without something in my hand, coming across here, it doesn't make as much sense to do a deflection with these two fingers. That's not going to stop anything. It's probably just going to hurt your fingers and not be effective. So coming here with those two fingers, so doing this movement with that hand posture there is to remind you that you can do this movement with something in that arm to help with that deflection. Of course, if you don't have anything in that hand, you can do that deflection with your hand, but then it would make more sense to hold your hand something like this, where you have the option of grabbing and it's not tied up in this kind of awkward, strange hand posture. And this hand posture allows you to push the sheath nice and firm against your forearm here, so it's not likely to get bounced off or moved from where you want it when you're doing this defense and counterattack. We also talked about the perspective of those fingers being used for support when you're doing different techniques. Now it makes sense if this hand's filled with something that I'm not going to be able to grab this sword or grab my wrist or do something like that to support the movement. But if I have something in this hand and I'm doing a movement, I can use that to help support the movement without dropping what I'm holding on to. So again, that hand posture makes more sense when you consider having something in that hand. And you also notice if you're doing a cut, as you're doing this, you have something down low that's deflecting while you're cutting. So not only are you getting support from that movement, you also have a little added defense in that movement. And when we're looking at the little dipper posture, remember we were talking about using those two fingers to support at the elbow or at the wrist? Well, if I have the sheath in this hand, I can do that support. But at the same time, I have something down here so that if an attack is coming around toward my abdomen while I'm cutting up with the sword, I have something that can get in its way. And the last movement that we talked about was the Big Dipper. And you notice here, even with the fingers pointing up, so they're not pointing forward like I'm doing an attack towards someone, they're pointing up. When I come across with that, I now have defense here where I can deflect something that's coming in, and I can do my attack from up high. So in all of those movements, you can see how having something in this hand, whether it's the sheath or something else, probably the sheath, is going to add an extra layer of defense while you do your movement. So the reason this hand posture exists in the Tai Chi Straight Sword forms is to remind the practitioner that they should use whatever's in their environment, whether that's their sheath, a stick, another sword, anything else, to add an extra layer of protection for themselves. And I think you'll find as you practice your Tai Chi Straight Sword forms, you'll find that the movements that you're doing make a lot more sense if you think about holding the sheath in the empty hand while you're going through your techniques. So why don't we just start practicing our forms from the beginning, holding a sheath in our left hand while we're using the sword in the right hand. Part of it is because when you're first learning sword work, it's hard enough to figure out what's going on with the sword, that adding something to the left hand that you also have to keep track of is just going to complicate things. And really the main thing that you're wanting to perfect is your sword technique, not necessarily the extra things that you can be doing with your left hand. That's something that comes with time. But if you can have someone keep their hand in certain positions, move it in certain ways while they're learning to really refine and hone their sword work, then adding something to that hand is going to feel much more natural because the hand's already ready to move in those ways. The muscle memory is already there. You'll also notice that this explanation for why this hand posture exists can incorporate all of the other perspectives, all the other explanations as part of it. So the first one was it's there to balance what's going on. Well, having something in that hand is definitely going to balance what's going on because you have something going on in both hands. Or it's there for support, like we talked about. Using something in this hand to support what's going on with this hand is going to be more stable than just using those two fingers. So it also supports that perspective of this hand posture exists for support. For energy balance, it also works in that perspective. So if you're holding something in this hand, then you no longer just have something in the right hand that's potentially going to draw energy asymmetrically. You have something in both hands to balance out the energy flow through your body. And then also for attacks, either to the opponent's pressure points or just soft sensitive areas, it also makes sense to do that with something that's going to be stronger than your fingers in that attack. So if I use my fingers to do that attack, the only thing that's there is my fingers, and they better be strong enough or it's just going to end up hurting me. If I'm holding something in that hand and I do that same attack, well, that is going to be stronger probably than my fingers on their own. And so the idea of it being an attack also makes more sense. The only perspective that isn't really helped by the understanding that that's a placeholder for holding something in the left hand is the perspective of shooting energy at your opponent. So potentially that might be easier if you're holding something, potentially it would be more difficult while you're holding something. But that's the only perspective that really doesn't match with this perspective. So it's important to note that using swords for fighting is not something that's practical in today's world. And the purpose of this video isn't necessarily to make you a better sword fighter, because that's probably not something that many people are striving for. The real purpose of this video is to give you the understanding of the practical reason for that hand posture, so that the movements of the form as you practice make more sense to you. And having that understanding will help you move more correctly as you go through your form. It will also help open up your mind to more possibilities of what's going on in the form as you practice. I hope you've enjoyed this video on the purpose of the sword finger hand posture. I hope you learned something, and if nothing else, have just been given some food for thought. If you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and also consider becoming a supporting member of this channel to help ensure that more videos like this can be made in the future. There's a link down in the video description that will let you see what it means to be a supporting member, and also give you the option of becoming a supporting member. Stay safe and healthy out there, and as always, thank you for watching.